The beautiful mice. An experiment with mice, of a carefully constructed area and set living conditions that couldn't be changed by the mice, and they couldn't escape. They were beholden to the experiment, and it ran its course, as it was meant to, repeatedly, and the results came back the same. Universe 25, the behavioural sink, created a series of rat utopias, enclosed spaces in which rats were given unlimited access to food and water, enabling unfettered population growth. From Wiki. There is much more to it, and I suggest you read through. And as you know, I have written other articles about animal and people experiments, In a Maze, An Experiment But a Big One, and Memory, as well as the odd crazy idea or two like changing into what exactly. But I was unaware of the behavioural sink experiments until only a few weeks ago, and clearly given what has occurred in society over the last 3 years, certain sections of certain societies definitely seem to be going through what appears to be a very similar circumstance to those unfortunate mice. Fully engineered to be that way, of course, as we see with the current human counterparts. In his most famous experiment in the series, Universe 25, population peaked at 2,200 mice and thereafter exhibited a variety of abnormal, often destructive behaviours, including refusal to engage in courtship, females abandoning their young, and homosexuality. Now, you can make of that what you will, but it does go some way to answer some of my questions about nature v nurture, and of environmental causes being the root of certain social and behavioural changes in people and animals. Unfortunately, I am unsure of when we were ever normal, if we were, and to know when there was ever a time people weren't messing around with things and influencing the outcome somewhat, tinkering and tailoring to requirement. And at this point, I suddenly think of one of my favourite books as a child, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, and the film of it, The Secret of Nim, which of course is about a group of mice and rats who escape a lab and an experiment, which upon looking it up again, it appears that it was written in reference to those very experiments that Calhoun was running. And I hadn't even realised what NIM stands for. Shaking head at my own stupidity here. As it stands for National Institute of Mental Health. I guess it was interesting to read and see about what happened once the rats and mice escape, because it was nice to think that some do, giving very little thought to what went on in the lab, other than what you were told. But we have had our own version along the way, just bigger labs and more subjects and studies by the whitecoats. Such as television programmes like Big Brother and Celebrity Get Me Out of Here make me think of strange short-term human versions of this scenario, to observe how they react in close quarters with strangers, without enough food, and having to play whatever game they come up with to entertain the viewers. But the purpose of the game is always much more than it appears. They will have also observed people within military and penal settings for this behaviour, knowing how much is enough, or too much, and steering the mood and mentality where they want it to go. Anywhere where you deliberately crowd people and keep them restricted, whether it be by rules or barriers, a similar mindset develops. Boarding schools also spring to mind here, and tower blocks, regimented, ordered, and making sure you get limited privacy. I used to wonder why they built houses so close together, why they planned them with windows facing each other, and in a way that made it appear to be about community and ease of services to each location, but it wasn't really. Just as these 15-minute towns and cities aren't, it appears to be about continuing to condition people to be mentally prepared to be physically herded into safe zones, and to only rely on a central point to advise you, guide you, and look after you. But really, I now see society and all the new ideas being rolled out as an extension of Universe 25, but for people. And they know what happens when you put in too many, and just stop feeding them. They will either feed you to death, or then take it away and watch the mayhem ensue, which results in destruction either way, turning instinct into a self-destructive force if it isn't allowed to follow a natural course. We have ended up being in a zoo either way, just currently it appears to be an open one. For now. Universe 2030. A follow-on piece of sorts from The Beautiful Mice and their dysfunctional lives in the grip of the behavioural sink. And from the experiment and their limited thoughts on the process, I see a very large problem with their findings now I have given it further thought. Even at first, I could see a point of issue. With them keeping the conditions set and the mice captive, meant the experiment would always run that way, because that's what was required, seemingly not to discover the results, but to prove them. So, the conditions were set up to deliver said result. The mice behaved as expected, and it was conclusive, they say, self-destruct every time. And like in the article, I mention how in the fictional story of the Rats of Nim, they broke out and forged a new existence. Theorising, I guess, that if they did have a chance to leave that set-up, awful life, they would. As people would. I had already realised some people have already suffered a similar fate to the experimental mice. Years ago, when a terrible drought happened in Darfur, they said lots of people were dying. So, me being of a simple thought process, wondered why they aren't just relocating to better conditions, as logic would dictate. And they tried, it turns out. But due to modern borders, conflict and politics, they were prevented from leaving or were slaughtered if they tried to cross the border. What a logical human or animal might do to negotiate a perilous situation is hampered and engineered often to be a certain way. And that's what is created, to try and dictate the final result. They've run the simulations, have models, data and projections to predict and create the conditions, expecting a result they have planned for. But this is where I realise that once you take a precision plan out of the lab and into a live scenario, the parameters change somewhat and are prone to unforeseen circumstances. And here is where I shall steer away from mice and focus on jellyfish. Another interesting piece of information I noted at the time, although I can't locate where I read it, which has recurred as a thought in this idea. It was said that certain jellyfish bloomed in extreme numbers when they were killed. I think it was when there was a large amount in Japanese waters and it threatened the fishing industry, so they killed loads. And that seemed to cause a switch to flick, and instead of hundreds of eggs, they started producing thousands. So on that premise I wondered, what if the mice just carried on going through the motions and made no effort to evolve or adapt because their species didn't depend on them for survival? They were a small, separated subgroup with no purpose other than the experiment. And based on that, they believe that humanity will just collapse in on itself, that they wouldn't notice the conditions being set and the restricted living being forced on them to try and engineer the result they would want. Then be proved right when there is an elite group of humans who deserve to live more than the others, and will in fact take steps to facilitate the self-destruction of those others. But all it looks like is that a devious, callous part of human nature thrives in those types, possibly more so because they lack heart and compassion in the normal sense. Because while they have their resources and family set up to be in the optimal conditions to thrive, they go about making sure others' conditions aren't so favourable, ensuring they aren't able to reach the same level. It's still instinctual competitiveness to me, not really above basic animal instincts at all, just like the rest of us humans. Unless, of course, they aren't entirely human, but that strays into my article, Not Like Us. At this point, we are led to understand it is just humans, making bizarre and crazy requests of other humans, so that we put ourselves into the experiment so they can try and steer its outcome, trying to create Universe 2030. The rat race. A number, like the mice in The Beautiful Mice, but shows something different. A balance. The golden ratio of a living balance in a way, I guess. Not in a sterile Georgia Guidestones kind of way though. I give thought to the idea that we are unable to escape our container, apparently. So like the rats and mice that get put into the controlled environment, we are subject to the conditions, and all of that goes on to help form our habits and behaviours as individuals and as a group. Now, we are led to believe that back in the day, People had a certain amount of freedom to go where they want and do what they pleased. Within reason, of course. It would seem that being a complete arse or psychopath has never gone down particularly well as a likeable trait. So if you were a basically decent human being, you could have freedom, right? Wrong. Once I learnt of previous restrictions placed upon hard-working average people, for the sake of controlling wages and work distribution, mentioned in my article, A Working Strategy, I realised then that mostly we have been at the whim of other people's rules, boundaries and ideals for hundreds of years now, not just mere decades as some would speculate. What we thought was freedom, and what we apparently fight to preserve, was already a form of control and surveillance of our lives. It just didn't seem as intrusive. But the digital doomsday database goes some way to explain how we are just in a technological version and going through an update to past times. Same shit, different day springs to mind here. The census, taxes, records of birth and death, insurance companies listing your possessions and assets, banks having your financial fingerprint, governments now wanting your digital fingerprint for every breath and interaction of your life. Those things being now quantified as a transaction rather than experiences, or time or something more than a percentage in profit margin. But as I said, it's an extension of where we were before. This isn't all entirely new, just a new format to present it. Sometimes though, it does seem as though the powers that be view the ordinary folk as a bit of an infestation. How we might view rats, even though we would be the ones that allowed them to congregate in what we would call unnatural numbers. Like people, herding them into cities at strategic points in the past, causing health issues by way of conditions, paving the way nicely to then appear to help with said health problems. Prevention rather than cure used to be the way, so a fear of what was to come was needed, to make people believe that the cure would be better than the end result. So we are led to believe that there needs to be an intervention to stop it all getting out of control. But what if that's what stops it ever stabilising? That it needs to reach a critical mass and turning point, needs to run its course and find a balance within its own circumstance and environment, without interference. We'll never know, as we are constantly being interfered with, manipulated, steered and treated like the commodity they see us as. And we get tricked into believing we are, and seem to act accordingly. All of us. So, as many are wondering these days, why do we all appear to accept the unfolding mayhem and disaster we see around us, and not actually do anything about it? And I do wonder, who is more of an idiot? The people in suits talking nonsense and pretending to lead? Or is it the people on the ground who still listen and look up to these people? Looking to them for guidance still? It's baffling. Because if the rats had realised it was other rats that were keeping them in a maze, and messing with them for fun and money, starving them just to see, and other ghastly things, would they go insane? Escape? Get revenge? Put up with it and just lose the will to live? Perhaps all of those, as we see around us. They appear to be going for a bigger net to catch everyone, and at the same time trying to create a smaller and more confined area for their projects, wanting to monitor, medicate and dictate your purpose like a parasite. And all of these systems and algorithms now appear to be an electronic version of one. Like we had the computer viruses, now we have the computer parasites. Because if you aren't in the system, giving it your time and energy, thoughts and data, it can't work as intended or survive. People, however, can survive quite well without them. In a maze. It's not a secret that we have been subjected to a psychological test recently, as well as other not so obvious ones that have taken place for decades. Psychological and physical, some of which we do know about. My article, An Experiment but a Big One, goes into that side of it a little more. But this is about how often I think of rats at the moment, and how we are treated like them in a way, and have been for at least the last few years. Or maybe somewhat before, but in a far less noticeable way as a group. I first thought of it with regards to the rapid antigen tests. The clue is in the word, rat. I thought it would be funny if it was any other scenario, but the twisted humour of it didn't escape me. that after restrictions were brought in and rules and regulations to go with the masks and vaccination passes, it seems like we were being herded into an endless maze with these rat tests to complete. Well, not all of us went along with it, but enough did for the experiment to really take off. Poisoning rats. It's a thing that you don't want to poison the rat on the spot usually. Instead, they know that the rats like to share and socialise, so they give them something seemingly sweet to take back to the nest. And I thought of the claims of jab shedding, that after people had been tainted, they would return to their nest and it would be spread that way, through socialising and intimacy. Now, that is where we differ from rats apparently, in that a rat can detect abnormalities and disease in potential mates, so will avoid. Memory. There have been many experiments using rats and generally rodents as the subject, and from those experiments I have already wondered about if it works in people in the same way. The brief of that being, they took mice and hamsters and conditioned them to be afraid of the dark. They then liquidized them and injected them into rats, who previously had no fear of the dark. Once you get over that awfulness, that we do things like that just to see, the results revealed, although contested, that the rats who were injected developed a fear of the dark. Now if you can do that to people, you don't even need to repeat conditioning. You can just inject it technically. But what of the inherited memory they sometimes talk about? Maybe we just never really looked at whose memory we inherited, or what other cell memory can be contained within things. Makes me wonder about reincarnation stories too, and of the ones which seem so very plausible. Could they be cell memory that has been picked up through genetics and carried down the line to give an overlay effect in the current life? Also, I think of the part of the premise in the film The Island, 2005, where one of the clones starts developing unique personality traits and is shown to have grown memories from the original host, despite having never experienced them. Bit of a tangent there, but this is where the clone cloak starts to fail. Like in Aeon Flux, where everyone has been recycled so many times it starts to get a bit hazy of which life you are actually in. Same with Dark City, where they keep swapping memories around to create different lives for people, to study them and their behaviour once in the simulated experience they think is real. Mazes. The classic test or game they like to show with lab rats, the one where the rats work out they can push a button and get a reward. So they press the one they are trained to press, and they get food, or whatever treat they have primed it for. And in the bigger version, the maze, there are a series of tasks to perform to find your way out. We do this to people as well, but again, seems not really to have been noticed by many, that the maze is society, and each little hallway and turning that is blocked is one of their systems and regulations for you to adhere to, or accept to be able to continue. If you don't push the button, computer says no. They hold the keys to each pathway and each door or access point. They made sure of that before they announced you were in a maze. Rats don't get out of the lab usually. Once you're in, you're in. There are a few sayings for animal related things we used to apply to human things we do blindly to get through the system. Like rats in a maze, jumping through hoops, the carrot and the stick method. All methodology of animal training, but used for us too, it would seem. So, by using those phrases, are we as a group in fact very aware of what is being done around us and to us? But because we are too busy chasing our tails and acting like headless chickens, we can't seem to do anything about it.